Hi guys, welcome to iFinance. Today I want to talk about how to profit from marijuana stocks. So let's get to it. So as you guys know, the sector is poised to grow at a roughly 23% clip until 2025. And this growth in particular focuses on the medical marijuana sector. As you can see, this sector is probably going to be the main growth driver. And what does exactly this sector involve? You can see here things like the flowers themselves. They can also make edibles out of this, oils, concentrates, topicals, and other accessories. In general, it has multiple uses, and in fact, you can even make a soda like Coca-Cola, but based on the CBD from marijuana, which, as you guys know, you have the THC active component and the CBD component. The THC is the one that actually gets you high, while the CBD component is the one that actually has most of the positive properties of the plant itself. So naturally, there are countless opportunities here. As you might expect, there's been a lot of companies that have been IPOing in the market since 2017. In fact, some may be earlier, but the wave started at 2017. The question is, how do we profit from all these potential opportunities? Let's try to get to it. But before we get into details of what I consider 3 great strategies, and we'll get to that in 1 second, but before we get into all that, first consider that the industry itself is very young, and unlike other industries like, for example, retail, you will probably not find a single company that has been operating for over a decade, let alone even 3 years. So you have to realize that in that type of environment, everything you might pick as an investment will probably end up being highly speculative. And highly speculative stocks can incur in massive losses for you. And obviously, you can also make a lot of money, but it is a very high risk, high reward cocktail that you have to accept if you want to participate in the sector. And for this reason, it is very difficult to actually be able to nail down a certain set of stocks, let alone one single stock that is going to outperform everyone else. It is very similar to picking during the tech boom, in the tech bubble, to picking the next Amazon or the next Apple. It is, statistically speaking, very unlikely that you will be able to do that. However, in theory, if you do it, you will make a lot of money. In practice, it is not realistic for you to expect you will be able to do that. So the way you have to approach this sector has to have a strategy that is based on 1, extensive research, and 2, diversification. So as I previously mentioned, the first strategy you would in theory conceive is to go and look as many companies as you can, research them in depth, and go over hundreds and hundreds of companies until you find the very best and you stick with that one. But in reality, as I said, it's not very viable, not realistic to do this, because researching one single stock takes often a few days. At least if you're going to do it right, you'll probably want to research them a few days. Obviously, there are going to be stocks that you can research for a couple hours and know that they're not worth your time. But when you start narrowing down that short list, you will realize that in order to really make a decision, you're going to have to make very careful research, and that simply takes a lot of time. We're talking about at least a week per stock if you're really doing your homework. And so it is not viable. If you want to do it, you can go ahead and try to do it. You will probably have to spend a lot of time. So it's probably not a viable strategy for a lot of investors. A good shortcut to all of these problems is to simply look at the ETFs on the sector and look at their holdings. And this way, what you will do is filter out all those stocks that didn't make the cut, not even for the ETF. And if they didn't do so, then chances are they are not worth your time. This is an assumption that you have to make, but it's probably a reasonable one. So you will be fine with this one. This way you have a much more narrow list, still a big list, but it is much more shorter. From this list of holdings within the ETFs you're looking at, you would pick a set of them and start actually researching them in depth, and the result would be probably preferable and much more efficient than if you've taken the original route of going over hundreds and hundreds of companies yourself. This way you have a much reduced pool of stocks that you have to go over. So that is a good way of starting, right? It's a good starting point. However, then the question is, how many stocks should you hold in your portfolio? And second, how big should those positions be? Would you make all of them equally weighted, or would you make one bigger than the rest? How do you go about that? So those are the key questions I want to answer here. So the first strategy I think you need to consider is to simply buy an ETF. An ETF is a stock that holds a bunch of different stocks within the sector. So this way you instantaneously gain exposure to a whole sector with one single stock. So it is a very efficient way of doing so. Plus, the ETF is likely managed by professionals, and so you have that covered right out of the gate. Here, I recommend you to look into two ETFs that I think are the best in the sector. And I think they're probably the most well-known too. But anyways, the first one is the ETF Alternative Harvest ETF, or the ticker MJ. And what this one does is follow an index in the marijuana sector. And essentially what you're doing is buying a holding of marijuana stocks that have focus on recreational purposes, but also medical applications. So yeah, that's the basic idea of the holding. And the second ETF you should look into is the Horizons Marijuana Life Sciences ETF, or HMMJ. This stock actually follows a different index, but the index is called the North American Marijuana Index. But if you look at the components of this index, at the end of the day, it tracks the very same things. They track recreational applications and medical applications for marijuana. So it's no wonder that if you look at the holdings of both ETFs, they're extremely similar. Even though they're different in concept, slightly different in concept. For example, the HMMJ is, from my understanding, it's a little bit more focused into the biotech side of marijuana, whereas the ETFMG is kind of like a broad take into the whole sector. So, in fact, the ETFMG actually holds a position on Philip Morris, which is a tobacco company. But it really doesn't make sense why it does that, but apparently it does that. And so those are the two ETFs that I think are the most prominent in the sector you should look into. And by the way, both these ETFs I think they actually have the exact same expense ratio of 0.75%. And if you look at the performance of both of these ETFs, they've been actually very similar to each other. And so they're basically the same ETF. They're managed by different companies, but they're very similar. So just know that. Still, if I were to recommend one particular ETF, I would say go with the HMMJ. I think it's the way they build the ETF and their focus on medical marijuana applications. It's preferable over the more diversified approach of the ETFMG ETF. But anyways, that's something that you can make a decision for yourself. And as I said, it's not going to be that big of a difference. Now, as for the second approach, this is something I came up with myself. And I personally think it's a very good way of taking the best of both ETFs and using the knowledge both ETFs have when building the index and maintaining their positions. So what you basically do is you consolidate. You first take the top holdings of both ETFs, right? And what you see is that they overlap very much. So for example, both ETFs have the Kronos group as a top holding on their own ETFs. So what you do is you include that one in your short list. And what you want to do is to consolidate the top holdings of both ETFs and rank them based on how much they were as a percentage of the total ETFs in their respective ETFs, if that makes sense. So what you get is basically the best stocks according to both ETFs. That's essentially the idea. This process, for me, it yielded that you would look into these 6 stocks, which are the Kronos Group, GW Pharmaceuticals, Canopy Group, Aurora Cannabis, Tilray, which is a famous one, and Afria. And if you're following the sector, you will realize that these 6 stocks are probably the most well-known. And with these 6 stocks, you probably are going to have enough exposure to the sector, be well enough diversified, and I think it probably would be enough just by going through this. Now, the cool thing is that this precise portfolio actually outperform both ETFs. So if you simply bought these 6 stocks and held, and since 2019, you would have actually outperformed the other two ETFs. You can see the math for yourself. It is pretty obvious that there's something to this strategy. Of course, I think it could be that maybe there's some overfeeding to this, but from what I've researched in the sector, these 6 companies are actually the best among the whole sector. So I'm fine with it. But what you're going to want to do is to rebalance this portfolio probably once every month. And the way you would do it is to simply repeat the process and rebalance accordingly. If you want to have more detail in the process itself of how to build this portfolio, then you can check out the article on Seeking Alpha that I wrote. I'm going to leave a link in the description when I get it published. But personally, I like this approach very much. And I think it is the best way that a completely new investor to the sector can take and build on forward. And finally, what you would do in terms of position sizing, I took a fractal approach to the capital allocation. This is something that you don't have to approach. You don't have to do yourself if you don't want to. But I thought it was the one that actually made most sense. I preferred this over simply assigning an equal weight to all the stocks, because after all, if you're ranking them, you're gonna want to use that ranking for something. So I think to me that makes sense, but maybe for you, you can simply put the same weight on all of them, and it could be fine. It wouldn't be that bad either. But this approach in particular seems to work. Just have that in mind. Also, it is also important to have in mind that according to my calculations, if you invest $1,000 in the sector, this approach would probably be fine for you. If that's the case for you, if that's what you want to invest, maybe more, then this approach is probably the best you can do. Obviously, you can tweak it a little bit for yourself, but you can look into it. And lastly, strategy number 3, which in my opinion is more like a bonus. Why? Because it is like a blended approach between the strategy number 1 and strategy number 2. So essentially, this third strategy consists in taking an ETF and complementing it with the 2 stocks of your selection from the short list from the strategy number 2. So that's why it's the blend of strategy number 1 and strategy number 2. And the cool thing about this is that it allows you to stock pick from within a short list of stocks, while at the same time getting the baseline diversification that the ETF itself gives you. So it is a very clever way of building a portfolio. As for the position sizing, you would go 50% on the ETF, 30% on your top stock, and 20% on your second top stock. That would make it 100%, and you would essentially be very well diversified, but at the same time overweight on those 2 stocks that you think are special according to your own research. So that's it, guys. Those are the 3 strategies that are probably going to make you money in the marijuana sector. And I think you should look into them. I think it's a very safe way of betting into the sector. But before you leave, let me give you one last tip, because as you know, this is a very speculative sector, and I want to emphasize the following. First, keep a small position. Second, consider that all the marijuana holdings right now that you might have are one single security. Imagine that's the case, and then position size accordingly. A good way of position sizing your exposure to the sector is to simply invest no more than 3 times your monthly income. This is a personal rule of mine. It's worked personally for me. You can tweak a little bit with it, but it is a good rule of thumb. I found that. Why do you want to do this? I mean, after all, you have to realize that this is a very speculative sector. It is trading on high hopes of future growth, which might not realize, guys. After all, exporting and growing marijuana is not necessarily something that can build a competitive advantage. You see Colombia already getting into the business. That could drive down the price of cannabis, which would have a devastating effect on all of these companies and the sector as a whole. So just have that in mind. It is still a very speculative sector, and this way you will make sure you keep your risk under control, but at the same time you will have the possibility to enjoy any potential gains. So that's it, guys. Thank you very much for watching until the end. Thank you very much again, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.